Ted, you know, there's this drama. I love the description of, I mean, really, Chad, you sort of opened my eyes to the stage directions that actually Luke is unfolding for us. We're like seeing the scene. Um, Talk about drama in week 3 of our series, which continues, the gospel just continues where it left off in week 3. So he's proclaimed this. And now the hometown folks get a little bit irritated. And I mean, there is a cliff involved, so that's to put it mildly. Um, so I know, Ted, that I've experienced your work in many settings, including our collaborations in United Methodist International gatherings. People have not always been happy with your interpretations, because you have powerfully invited them to new perspectives, invited them to consider things that perhaps they just weren't willing. And so they went after you, and they went after the art, in terms of vandalism sometimes. Um, so I'm thinking you have an affinity with Jesus on this pericope. What is your assessment of the dynamics at work here when people are having strong reactions and they hear something that makes them consider difficult things, especially, interpretations, asking them to change their ideas or their perspectives, or especially their practices? That's the hardest thing, right? Changing what we're doing. I'm thinking some of your work on environment, and there were several things. So what comes up in you as you consider this particular week when the folks are ready to push Jesus off the cliff?
Yeah, my first response would be the cliff is real.
Hmm.
Um, there is no mattress at the bottom. And the risk is high. The risk
Yeah.
is high. I mean, when we were working together and the stuff that I was doing was, it was a large stage.
Mhm.
But it's not any different from, I mean, you reduce the scale of the stage, and I mean, there are still relationships at risk here. There are
Yeah.
still people who are involved in this in some very, very deep ways and are responding in some very, very human ways.
Yeah.
And so that risk is high. The relationships that will get torn here, I mean, those are deep and important relationships. The cost is as steep as the cliff.
Mm.
This is not going to be easy. And I don't want to skip us too far up to to week 5 with vision, but the blessings and the woes, when Jesus gets into that
Yeah.
really that part, it's like he's like, he told us this was coming. It came for him with the cliff, and like, blessed are you when they drag your ass to the cliff.
Right. Right.
This is going to happen. This is going to
Yeah.
happen not just to those who are, risk takers and prophets. It's going to happen to anybody that's following this dude. So the affinity that I have was like, well, yeah, um, you kind of said this was going to happen. It kind of happened to you before we even got to when you said. But when he gets to that part about, blessed are you when they revile you, like,
Mm.
it turns on its head this notion of what does it mean to be blessed. Well,
Mhm.
I mean, if a blessing is the presence of the divine, the presence of God will surround you. So in those moments when they tear you down, when they destroy your work, when they drive by your church, and they shoot the windows out, when you receive death threats,
Yeah.
you are surrounded by the mystery. You are there with God in ways that those who are preaching the prosperity gospel will never understand.
Mhm.
This
Mhm.
isn't, this isn't about being blessed in that way that my bank account bulges. This is about being blessed in the
Right.
way that God is with you, and those who are around you have empty cups that need to be filled as
Yeah.
much as yours needs to be filled.
Yeah.
Yep.
So moving into this, thing called discipleship is it's risky business. I mean, these cliffs are real and these stones are sharp, and this is going to hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's not the end of the story.
Yeah.
It's not the end of the story.
Mhm.
The blessings that come throughout that, the cost is steep, but you're tapping into something that is much more important and deeper and richer.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it comes, and it comes at a high cost, and it's painful. For me, the experiences that I've had where my work was not received well, some of them were quite public, some of them were very, very intimate and private. But I suspect that every person who has answered the call to preach, who has answered the call to being a pastor, we all had these experiences where sometimes you were misheard and sometimes you were heard very clearly.
Mm.
Um, but the cliff is real.
Yeah. Ben, you wrote in the sermon fodder in response to having engaged with Ched's work, you said this about week 3. You said, to Jesus, it seems that the entrenched parochialism of his hometown that vilified outsiders and Gentiles was just as problematic as the domination of the Roman Empire. How we treat the least among us is far more an indication of who we are than our religious or cultural identity. I feel like that's a great way to feel what Jesus' audience felt, which is indicted. How we treat each other. We can talk a good game about overarching oppression without looking more closely at our own practices. And I think you rightly point out from your own experience that this is hard for preachers to muster the courage to invite people into considering this. So how do we walk that fine line when something is important to say and yet the cliff is there and it's very real? What do you as a pastor? I'm not asking you to talk for all pastors, but how does it affect you?
I One of the things I'm struggling with today is whether or not the fine line actually should be walked at all. People who walk on the tightrope in their preaching, it's very easy to forget, I think.
Mm.
I, Jesus was ready to preach that sermon in Luke 4 because before he did that, he went into the wilderness for a very long time,
Mm-hmm.
and he had encounters with the worst of the demonic and the temptations and all of these hardships. And I think that there's something about that related to our own experience as preachers,
Mm-hmm.
at least encountering the stories that can in some way resemble the kinds of oppressions that we're trying to preach against. One of the things I will never be afraid to very directly and bluntly and potentially offensively preach about is the evil of our immigration system. And the reason I have no problem doing it, and whether or not I get driven to the cliff, I can't not do it, is because I have been to the border. I went to Ursula Detention Center during the time when we were separating families. I saw the charter buses and I saw the children inside of them. And so that experience of bearing witness to it or experiencing it yourself even is, I think, the strength of, that's where a lot of that strength of the prophetic voice has to come from. And look, a lot of our churches aren't necessarily in neighborhoods that are directly connected to people who have those stories of oppression or those experiences of poverty. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a way for us to bear witness to those forms, those experiences that people have in our own personal, discipleship. To follow Jesus means to follow people who are oppressed and to be in relationship with them. It's the whole notion of if you're going to do work related to homelessness, but you don't bother to learn people's names and get to know them as human beings, then you're not necessarily you're not going all the way to the end point in which we need to be getting to with homelessness, which is that everyone should be treated as a human being and not just as a statistic or as a problem to solve, right? And so I don't know if there's a fine line. I'm struggling with managing my sense of what the hell the fine line even is after the series of events happening politically in our country right now. And so I know that that's not a helpful answer for pastors to hear, but I do think that if you're struggling to find a place to experience the conviction that gives you more courage than the fear that you have, then find the stories and go out and experience and bear witness to these things that are happening in the world so that you can come back and tell your congregation about them. I don't know if I have anything more deep than that to say myself.
Marcia,
Go ahead, Ched.
if I could just
Yeah.
add to that, Jesus' sermon in week 2 actually gets good reviews. It's the addendum in week 3
Right.
that causes the little trip to the cliff.
Mhm.
And that addendum is here's what I just said, and here's what here's what you think it means, and it doesn't mean that. And Jesus uses examples to try to denationalize this from the people's own sacred history. He's invoking the 2 greatest wilderness prophets, Elijah and Elisha. This text is a brilliant example of recontextualizing scripture in order to let it do the heavy lifting. As I often say to audiences, don't give me the stink eye. I didn't write this stuff.
That's right. How can you not talk about this stuff? Yeah.
I think too many preachers, both liberals and conservatives, are overly timid precisely because we're not handling these texts in both their social political context and in our own.
My goodness.
It's far better for our congregations to wrestle with their scriptures than with their preachers, because these texts represent ancient wisdom, which is desperately needed medicine for a world collapsing, the result of continuing social, economic, and racial divides. That said, people, and especially their leaders, do tend to domesticate their historic prophets, just like Jesus' audiences were doing, turn them into stained glass patrons. In the book, I draw an analogy to Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence speech in 1967. Americans who loved the Nobel Peace Prize winner's quality of character, not color of the skin, eloquence, bristled when he turned a searing critique on the Indochina War, boldly questioning the nation's integrity. King's meddling
And against capitalism, too.
That's right.
Either.
His meddling in both economic and foreign policy matters was perceived by most people as going too far, and his affront to national innocence provoked the official conspiracy to silence him. So, though Jesus will ultimately meet the prophet's fate, here early on in Luke's story, apparently the Nazarene is already practiced at the art of social maneuvering through skirmishes. So perhaps we preachers need to learn these skills as well.
Right. Right. Truth. Truth.
And the choreography is pretty simple that I've learned from you, Ched. Text, context, recontextualization. You start with the text, learn what that context is, and then recontextualize it. I mean, you bring that into here and let it do its work. It's a 3-step choreography. It's pretty simple.